thank you for watching State and Local again. This is Norfolk Public Access that you're watching, of course. I'm Anne Marie Battistone, and I'm just thrilled today that we have the state auditor with us. She's come to talk to us about her campaign. She's going to answer a few questions and tell us about being an auditor. And I'm just thrilled to have her here. Thank you so much for coming. I'm
glad to be here.
Yes, I really appreciate you coming all the way out and finding time for us.
Oh, quite all right.
Now, just to start, could you tell us what the auditor's office is supposed to do or does do?
So the auditor's office is one of 6 constitutional offices. So we are elected statewide every 4 years. Our jobs are written into the Constitution. The auditor's office is part of the system of checks and balances in government. And so it's my responsibility to be part of, but independent from the executive branch and to, as well as from the judiciary, obviously, and to essentially follow the money that's being spent by agencies. But not just to find out how much they spent, but to ask questions about how did they spend it? Did they follow the rules when they spent it? Then we ask, what did we get for it? What did the taxpayers get for it? Was it delivered, were the services delivered as effectively and as efficiently as possible? Were there proper controls in place to prevent its abuse or being wasted? And we also ask increasingly, how can we do it better the next time? And we make those reports back to the agencies and also to the legislature, and then work with the legislature when it's necessary to fix agencies that have gone off track.
Now, is that what you mean by the performance auditing and compliance auditing? Because I know that you had made a distinction between that and the business auditing that Patricia St. Aubin talks about.
Right. Yeah. In Massachusetts, the financial statement auditing is not done by the auditor's office. That's the responsibility of the comptroller. And the comptroller actually engages the services of one of the big firms. In this case, in the current contract is with KPMG. And they're the ones that prepare the so-called single audit of the Commonwealth to ensure compliance with federal spending rules, and then the comprehensive annual financial report. So we don't do financial auditing. We, of course, make use of financial data when we're looking at agencies to see that they are complying with the rules about how you safeguard money that the Commonwealth is taking in, how you account for all of the money that's being spent. But then it's through the performance audit process that we really look at the agency's mission, whether it's protecting children or providing transportation. Whatever it is, we look at the mission and we ask questions about how effectively and efficiently they're using resources to accomplish that mission, if they're completely going off track, and what we can do to get them back on track.
So is that your answer to her? I know she's brought that up many times, that you personally are not a trained auditor.
No, what I am is an executive officer. Before I entered this position, I was in state government as a secretary. I administered 6 agencies, some of them in fact—
Labor and workforce?
Yep. So they were occupational safety and labor relations, workers' compensation, unemployment, insurance, and workforce training and career. So that's career services, and particularly in that area, there were hundreds of millions of dollars that flow through the state and out to workforce boards.
In salaries?
Yes, and also in money for training programs.
Oh, okay.
For training programs, they provide the training services at the career centers around the state, and so we would audit them in order to ensure that they were spending money properly. So I'm really familiar with how government works, how government spending works, and what accountability mechanisms there are for government.
So you looked into something at UMass Medical School involving bonuses. Was that the type of thing that you're talking about, and how these bonuses, and that some were overpaid, some were underpaid? I did read.
Yeah, so that's an example. We did an audit of the president's office at UMass. We wanted to make sure that, for instance, all of the monies that they assess from the other campuses were being properly used in accordance with the charter and the obligations that they have, and we looked at whether they were following the rules in awarding salaries. And we found when we looked,
yes, and the scorecards of the employees
that's right.
versus what they.
That's right. And at UMass Medical, we found that there was manipulation of the annual performance reviews, so that folks would get more money than they would otherwise have been entitled to. And we found big bonuses given to the director of the medical school. Now, I would say not by this current UMass president, but by his predecessor. And there was no basis for it. The man's contract didn't call for bonuses, and so there was no way to measure what he should get. And he got substantial bonuses when there was no provision in the contract for doing so.
Was there a legal action on that?
No, because it was an action that had been taken by the previous president. But what we do then is so then now the agency is on notice that this kind of thing is happening, and all of the campuses are on notice that they're not supposed to do it, and that there's someone looking out to make sure that they're spending the money properly.
You know, I couldn't find it again this morning, but I did see an interview. It was in 2010. I think it might have been at Suffolk. This was when you were running against, you were running for the first time, I suppose.
Sure, okay.
And you had said that electing a constitutional officer, which is what you are,
right,
with political skill and not just an auditor, and these are my words, was
sure,
important. I'm kind of, so well, why would the political skill come to bear? I mean, isn't your office nonpartisan?
Oh, it absolutely is. And so the political background is helpful, not in necessarily doing the audits. I mean, I think that the fact that years ago I was a state representative and understood policy making, and that then I was a cabinet secretary and understood how to implement programs there. I mean, that does provide a perspective and a set of skills, so that when I produce audits that call for legislative action, I understand what's necessary to build the support. Who do you bring in? Who's interested in the outcome, in what we found? So when we audited special education collaboratives, I didn't look it up in advance, but I would bet you that Norfolk, the town of Norfolk, is part of an education collaborative. And that's when schools come together in order to jointly create special ed programs that on their own they couldn't afford. So you get a group of kids that need a particular kind of services.
Like in Judge Baker, that type of thing.
No, this is the collaborative itself.
Okay.
So it's an alternative to Judge Baker. So what schools will do is, instead of send someone to Judge Baker or a more expensive private placement, they'll get a group of kids together that need a specialized service that's not available in the individual schools. And it's less expensive than than a Judge Baker placement.
Kind of like group insurance.
Yeah, so it's that kind of pooling together, and the idea is you provide special ed services of the same quality as Judge Baker, but at lower cost. So we found at a number of collaboratives that there was a lack of good financial management. They weren't following the rules about putting things out to bid to make sure that taxpayers were getting the best value and the like. There was one education collaborative up around Lowell, Lawrence area that was really the poster child for bad behavior. But at any rate, I stepped back and I said, well, look at all of these audits that have all of these findings. What does it say about this whole system of special education? Maybe we ought to look at what the whole system needs. And so we came up with a set of recommendations so that school districts, school committees would get more information about the operation of the collaboratives, so that the Department of Education didn't have enough ability to set standards for their operation. And so we reached out to then the School Committees Association, the School Superintendents Association, Advocates for Children, and brought everybody to the table and said, this is what we recommend needs to be changed in this system. And then we worked to file the legislation and get it through, and the governor signed reforms of that system into law within, I think, 8 months afterwards. So it's that ability to understand how you can look at the bigger picture understand how the law works and how you create a constituency around reform. So I think that that's the set of skills. And the result, I guess the proof you would say is in the pudding, because our audits have had an impact on at least 8 major pieces of law that have gone through, and that's unprecedented for the office.
Well, you mentioned education, because I had seen something on your website that talking about evaluating the quality of services, which I guess is what you were just talking about.
Yeah.
And then you had mentioned systematic improvements to prevent bullying relative to child welfare. How does the auditor's office?
I know it was.
What is that? What was that?
You wouldn't expect it. So a couple of years ago, the legislature passed a law that required schools to take additional steps.
Right.
And then they created a commission to say, okay, did we do enough with this law?
And they were supposed to have a bully specialist or
yes.
czar.
So school districts all had to create programs. They had to train all of their staff, right down to the volunteers on the playground and the bus drivers. So, but then the legislature created a commission, and they said, so did we do a good job with this law? And what we said, so we looked at the law ourselves, and what we saw was that there were no measures, no way to determine whether the law and the programs were having any effect, because there was no requirement that there be reporting of bullying. So if the school districts...
Now, what did that have to do with the auditors? How would that...
Because our view of this came out of a previous audit that looked at a law that was passed many years ago that outlawed hazing in schools. And what that audit found was that programs were not being implemented, and that there were no reporting requirements, so nobody could tell if anything was working or not. So based on the finding in that law about the implementation of hazing, the hazing prohibition, we said, this bullying law would benefit by requirements for reporting, so that we would know what works and what different works and what doesn't work, and what and how we can improve these programs if that needs to be the case. So it's an odd way that auditors' work would figure into a school bullying program, but it's that whole idea of how do we determine the effectiveness of our laws in our programs. One of the ways you do that is by measuring and by holding people accountable for the results.
So it's not strictly a financial
pursuit? This is about the results. This is about, are we getting what we're paying for? And are we, in other instances, I think an audit that a lot of people are familiar with had to do with the Department of Transitional Assistance.
Well, I was going to ask you about that.
You
mentioned welfare fraud and eligibility.
Right. So we did an audit of the Department of Transitional Assistance. They administer what we call welfare benefits. This was last year, 2013.
There's been an awful lot of indignation about these EBT cards and all of that.
And so we understand, that the public is rightly concerned. This is a matter of public trust. So we decided that we were going to audit the Department of Transitional Assistance, and we were going to look at their fraud detection and fraud fighting systems.
Shauna O'Connell was very concerned about all of that
Yes.
as well. And I remember they really stonewalled her when she was trying to get balances, anonymously, and finding these huge balances on these EBT accounts.
And so we looked at...
Was this at the same time?
It was around that same time. See, I think that's with political antenna, political sensitivity, when you're deciding what it is that you're going to audit at an agency, you figure out, well, how can this audit add value to a subject that the public really wants to know more about? So when we had to audit the Department of Transitional Assistance, I said, let's look at fraud fighting. How well are they doing making sure that only eligible people are getting benefits and that the benefits aren't being abused? And what we found, that fraud fighting was not a priority at that department.
No.
Not at all. Not at all. And so they, in addition to checking residence and income eligibility in order to qualify for welfare or food stamps. You're also supposed to check that the person is who they say they are.
Well, that's because I know that Shauna, one of the things I seem to remember reading about this was that they didn't have to provide Social Security.
No.
Which meant they could have been illegal aliens, they could have been
right.
anyone.
And we found, in fact, that over 1,000 beneficiaries, adults, and then another 1,000 or more dependents were using Social Security numbers of people who were dead.
Right.
And they were able to get those benefits because those Social Security numbers weren't being verified. We also found, so that was a problem with putting people on the rolls in the first place. We also found that the agency wasn't using the reports that their own computer system could generate and did generate every month about how and where benefits were being used.
Exactly. But it did eventually came out because Shauna was so dogged about it.
And we found
in Florida.
That's it. And so they could tell, in fact, exactly as you say, that benefits were being accessed for months at a time, out of state, or even down in out in Puerto Rico.
Yep.
We also found that for food stamp benefits, that there were numbers of people that they could find for themselves who would, on the day that the benefits became available, cash in the whole amount at the convenience store attached to the gas station down the street.
And then they were taking a percentage.
And clearly that's not feeding your family. So
Exactly.
So their failure to use the tools they already had
Why was it?
it just hadn't been a priority in the agency. People weren't trained. They didn't know how to read the reports that the system was generating.
Do you think this was a partisan? Because, let's be honest.
Yeah.
I think the vast majority of those people vote Democrat.
Yeah.
And don't you think that was where it came from?
No, I think, you know what I'm finding?
Me.
No, I appreciate.
I
I
it's only
understand why you
common
went
sense.
there. I understand why you went there. But the reality is that a lot of agencies just aren't spending enough time training their staff. They're not spending enough time understanding the capabilities of the technology that they have purchased. And therefore, then they're not very well managed, and you get these results like this.
But doesn't it come from the top? When you look at, this is not related to you, but when you look at through the whole state, all of these things that have gone on, that have had to do with poor management.
Yeah.
The crime lab, the compounding.
But But you look at welfare, which is an abuse of public trust. You look at compounding, which is an abuse of your public health. The crime lab, that was an abuse of the system of justice.
Huge amount of money involved.
And from what I see, and if you consider the Department of Children and Families, which we also audited, we find that there aren't enough qualified staff doing the jobs. There aren't enough qualified managers overseeing them. They don't have the technology. At DCF, for instance, they didn't have electronic record keeping that they could easily access.
How could that be? It's just
astonishing.
I know.
It is astonishing, and it's frustrating to me as a Democrat who wants, but as particularly as a Democrat, because I want people to believe in government. I want them to support these programs.
And you want your brand to.
And I want them to support these programs. I want them to care about kids. I want them to care about poor people who really do need help for a period of time. And when these programs get abused and when they're not well run, it erodes trust in them.
Didn't you also look into the vetting? I saw somewhere I read. Where was it? It had to do with, checking out providers, and they came around, found out that there were all these sex offenders living in these houses and these people working in these different places.
Yeah,
and it was just the tip of the iceberg.
Right. So what we found when we were auditing the Department of Early Education and Care.
That was, yes.
So they license, one of the functions of early education and care is to license daycare facilities.
Right, that's right.
And so what we found when we looked at it was that they weren't doing the inspections that they were supposed to,
Right.
among other things. Frankly, I don't even remember all of the things that we found that were problematic there. And it's all, remember, it's all about protecting children, little kids. And we also looked at, and goes to something I said at the beginning, which is how can we do it better? So we looked at, well, what other risks are there for kids in daycare centers? And we thought, well, protection from sexual predators would be something. And so we looked at the requirements, and the daycare facilities were not required to do an assessment to determine whether there was sexual predators in the area. Now, that wouldn't mean that you would close down the daycare center because somebody moved in, but it means that you would create a plan to take particular cautions against sexual predators coming in and saying that they were related to a student.
Oh, exactly.
So that's an area where we said, whoa, here's a risk that your regulations don't address. You really ought to be doing this.
It's just again, it's just astonishing.
Yeah. But that's the difference. That's the difference between financial auditing and performance auditing. And so that's why, again, it gets back to, I think that the reason we've been able to have audits of greater impact than, frankly, they had been is because of the background that I and new people that we've brought into the office have in asking these questions based on our knowledge of how government works and how it should work.
Was that part of the fault that was found with the previous auditor? Was that Joe DiNucci? Joe, was it Joe?
Joe DiNucci.
He'd been there 24 years?
Yeah, so he'd been there 24
It's just
years.
too long. I mean,
and he had, there had been good work that was done by that office, and it was still doing good work. But but when I took over, and actually when I ran in 2010, both the Republican Mary Connerton and I both said we're going to do a peer review, or we're going to have a peer review done, because you should have one done every 3 years. There hadn't been one done in 15 years.
You mean looking at the employees?
And no, it's looking at everything, the whole audit operation.
I meant yes.
Yes.
Okay, right.
So when I got elected, I called for a peer review, and that means that I called the State Auditors Association and said, "Would you conduct a peer review?" They went out,
And that's when they came in.
and they went out and they got a group of auditors from around the country. They selected them. They came in and they looked at staff competence. Is there the staff to do the job that needs to be done? And is this agency operating to government standards? The standards are set by the Government Accountability Office. They have to do with, that's it. They have to do with, right from the very first stages, how are we going to decide what we're going to audit at an agency? And what are the questions we're going to ask? What is the data we're going to look at? What are the systems we're going to assess? Who is it that we're going to interview? And then how do we record all of this? How do we weigh it? How do we document it? And then how do we write the reports? And what they said when they concluded their peer review was that the agency wasn't meeting government standards in any of those areas. And that meant that we have changed all policies and procedures. We have new technology. We have our own in-house training program.
You have a different time frame, don't you, also for looking at all three? Was it 375? Is it?
Yeah, we are changing
different agencies,
and we're working with the legislature to make changes in the law. We are required to audit. The law says two things: that we should audit every agency, every department, every 3 years. It originally had been 2 years,
yes.
And they said to us, you can't possibly do that. I said, don't I know it? There aren't enough staff to do it, and we changed the law to go to 3 years, but also to move us in the direction of doing risk-based auditing, because the fact of the matter is that not every one of those departments, every one of those departments needs to have a comprehensive audit every 3 years. It's not a good use of our resources to do a comprehensive audit of every agency every 3 years. So let's decide how we're going to use our resources based on risk. So when we look at an agency, when we're deciding what we're going to audit, we sift through all of the information about spending and personnel and who the contracts are with and what the so-called internal control plan looks like. Does it look like they have a plan to protect against risks that money will go astray and the like. And so we have a much more sophisticated system of deciding when we're going to audit an agency and what we're going to look at. And that's the trend all across the auditing world, is to focus on risks. So, because frankly, there'll never be enough resources to audit everybody, every agency.
All the line items.
Yeah, so what you do is, so where's the greatest chance that something will go wrong? Where's the greatest risk to, not just to money, but to taxpayers, in the cases that we've been talking about, to children? That's how we are looking at that. So for instance, in housing authorities, we were required to audit housing authorities on that same rotating cycle. And we ask the same questions no matter what housing authority it is that we go to, whether it's one with 62 units or 362 units. There's a lot more risk associated with 362 than 62. And so when the legislature just did the reforms of public housing administration, among a number of suggestions that we offered to them based on our audit experience, is that we are out of that cycle of paying as much attention to the tiny little ones where we don't see a problem and so that we can focus on risk in the larger ones. We'll still eventually get to the little ones, but they don't need our attention every 3 years.
You know, I did want to ask you about something that I noticed. I was surprised that you had asked for an endorsement from the Service Employees International Union, because I perceive that they made quite a bad name for themselves at some of these rallies that they've attended, some of these intimidation and violence and these some of the Tea Party rallies, and you know, that they, you know, not a very above board group. And so I was and I was also wondering, why would a union want to endorse the auditor?
Well,
does it have to do with the agencies that they work for that would be audited?
Well,
is that how that would affect them?
So there are a number of locals of the Service Employees International Union. Some of them are healthcare workers who are primarily in the private sector. Others are working in the treasurer's.
DCF.
Yep, some work at DCF. Others are at other
hospitals.
social service agencies. Yep, and some are in the treasurer's office. And so they are a constituency for the auditor's office, in the same way that school committees are a constituency. Now, SEIU happens to endorse. School committees don't necessarily endorse, but the idea is, when you're running for office, you look for who are the people who care about the work that I'm doing, and the work that we do impacts them not just in audits. It impacts. It sort of is a review of even the division. We have a division of local mandates that looks at whether something that is imposed upon a community by state government should be paid for by state government. Some workers, some unionized workers, are in municipalities. They're impacted by mandates that come down from the state that the state doesn't pay for. We get to decide whether the state should be paying for something based on a legal definition and a financial analysis. And so these are legitimate constituencies for the work of the auditor's office. And
do you think that they ever perceive that with this donation that maybe the audits might not be, that for these agencies that they work for, might not be as stringent, because these are their jobs?
Well, that shouldn't be an issue, because we're auditing management. We're auditing what the decision makers are doing, not what the line staff are doing. But they actually, when we did the DCF audit, we talked to some of them. They suggested some of the caseworkers that about. So when we audit, we don't just look at what the agency is supposed to do. We talk to the staff about what they really do. And the staff at DCF had said, you really ought to talk to our union leadership, because they've been complaining to the state about about this agency for some time. We didn't go as far. We didn't do that. I think that we should have, because we would have been able to learn even more about not what was wrong at the agency, but what could be done to improve things at the agency.
I've got to cut you off because we run out of time. It went so fast. But I mean, I said thank you so much. Really, we're so thrilled to have had you come out.
I love to explain what the office does to folks and the contribution that we're trying to make government work better.
Well, I was glad that you answered that question about because I have followed SEIU in the news quite a bit. But thank you again. We're state and local. We're going to have to go off very quickly. The election is November 4th. And our guest today was Suzanne Bump, and she's running for re-election for state auditor. Thank you for watching.